And thank you everyone for having me. I'm so thrilled to be there virtually with you. It's particularly special to be talking with a group that spends so much time thinking about some of the issues I wanted to explore in this book when it comes to the future of the global order and America's place in it and China's place in it. I wanted to start by giving you a little bit of context as to why I came to this story at all. I joined the Wall Street Journal in 2013. I had been covering fracking and gas drilling in Pennsylvania before that. So I came in to cover the Hollywood beat, quite green and quite new. And I was hired to bring a sort of set of fresh eyes to the job. And one thing I started to notice immediately was that China was popping up all over the place. And it would come in small ways. There might be a notice that a Chinese actress had been cast in a big Hollywood blockbuster, or that a Chinese billionaire was financing a slate of films at a major studio. And I think the sense in Hollywood was that it was China's turn to be dumb money, to come to Los Angeles, to make some movies, walk a few red carpets at the premieres, and leave with its tail between its legs, as other countries and other, wealthy individuals have done in the past. I started to suspect, however, that there might be a difference here because China brought to Hollywood two things that no other outside influence had ever brought. One was a huge home market. When I joined the journal in 2013, China's box office was already growing by double-digit percentage points a year. And it was already clear even then that eventually it would become the biggest box office market in the world. The other thing that China brought that no real foreign markets of that size had ever brought was a political party that was doing the best it could to censor and control the kind of material or content being released not only within its borders, but outside its borders as well. And so I thought this is a thornier story than just dumb money flowing into Hollywood. And I think over the next 3 or 4 years, as a contrast on the world stage emerged between China and the West, the movies became this unlikely proxy battleground for those two ideologies. And Hollywood really, for the first time in its history since its founding, became an industry that it seemed at times was serving another country before it served its home market. So I'll tell you a little bit about the dynamic that has taken shape over the last 25 years or so that explains how China grew to have so much leverage in the American studio system. American movies, as many here probably know, largely didn't travel to China after Mao's revolution. It wasn't until 1994 that American movies started to be exported rather regularly to China. And the first American movie allowed in under this new system was The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford. And at the time, The Fugitive made $3 million in China, which is nothing in Hollywood. I mean, it maybe pays for a couple executive salaries, but that's it. But in China in 1994, it was an absolute blockbuster. And it kicked off a moment where we started to see about 10 to 12 movies going to China a year. But again, not making enough money for anyone to really be paying much attention to. It wasn't until the late 90s and then into the early 2000s when we started to see a couple major hits, primarily films like Titanic and Avatar, really wake Hollywood up to the prospect of the money that could be found in China. Of course, it wasn't just that the movies were doing well. Something else very important was happening in China, which was that there was this incredible urbanization occurring that resulted in a number of new movie theaters being built every day. I mean, at one point, China was building 27 screens a day at a moment when the American box office, starting around 2008 or 2009, was starting to flatline. And ticket sales weren't rising here, but they were rising in China. So obviously it doesn't take a genius to see where the growth is in that dynamic. Now, so we have this reality where China's growing and America is flatlining. But since those earliest days, really since the fugitive days, China has made sure that it has control over not only the kinds of movies that are allowed into its country, but the way that they are shown, the way that they are distributed. There's very little actually in the studio's control when it comes to gaining access to that really lucrative market. I'm sure many people here have heard of the more high profile examples of the content that has to be censored before it can be shown in China. Just a few off the top of my head include there was a James Bond film called Skyfall several years ago that featured a scene in which James Bond broke into a Shanghai skyscraper and shoots a Chinese security guard. Well, that had to be cut from the film because Chinese officials didn't want Chinese citizens to look weak against even 007. There's also been some high profile examples when it comes to storylines involving homosexuality. So, for instance, the film Bohemian Rhapsody, which came out a few years ago about Freddie Mercury and the band Queen, all but eliminated every reference it had to relationships that Freddie Mercury had with men. And at one point, actually, when in a scene when he reveals that he's been diagnosed with AIDS, in some theaters in China, the sound went out so that the dialogue revealing his AIDS diagnosis couldn't be conveyed in the theater. Now, these are rules that I think anyone in Hollywood by this point has absorbed, and in some cases can even head off at the script level as a kind of practice of self-censorship. But it's a reality of doing business in China. And increasingly over the past decade, it's a reality that the studio executives are willing to stomach because it means accessing a box office where films can regularly gross hundreds of millions of dollars at a time when other global markets are struggling or actually declining. I thought it would be helpful to give you a case study to sort of show you where we were when this relationship between China and Hollywood really reached its fever pitch, or as some would say, probably a fever dream. And it's with a film that came out in 2014 that was a part of the Transformers franchise. So the Transformers movies, which not sure how many of you have seen, are these movies about big giant killer robots. They go after each other, bunch of explosions, a bunch of buildings are destroyed. You get the drift. Well, these movies were doing very well in China. And in fact, the executives at Paramount decided with the fourth installment that they were really going to lean in and they were really going to try to exploit the market for everything they could get. And so they cast Chinese actresses in roles. They hosted a reality show on CCTV where they cast cameos for the film. They had a ton of Chinese product placement deals signed, even though I have to say, when you watch the film, not many of the product placements make a lot of sense. There's a scene in which the characters use a Chinese ATM that is somehow in the middle of Texas. So it didn't seem like they really cared too much about the cinematic logic here. It's just so much as about getting those what they call Chinese elements into the film, as many as possible. And they also filmed about a third of the movie in Hong Kong and mainland China. Now, in order to really exploit the market, one of the things that Paramount, the studio behind this Transformers film, needed was some kind of certainty and a guarantee that they could lock in a release date for the film, because if it wasn't going to be released in China, all of those efforts would have been for naught. Now, part of locking in that release date required handing the script over to Chinese authorities who read the script. And they said, this is no problem. This looks good. We do have one note, though. And it's in the final scene of the film, in the big climactic battle, Hong Kong is being destroyed. And the Americans come to the rescue of Hong Kong. And the Chinese authorities had an idea where they said, We'd prefer it if Beijing came to the rescue of Hong Kong before the Americans show up. And the Paramount executive said, sure, no problem. So if you watch the film today, there's a really rather random moment where Hong Kong is being destroyed and the camera cuts to Beijing, where the Beijing defense minister says, we will protect Hong Kong at all costs. Now, this was in 2014. And looking at that film 5 years later, when I was reporting this book, that scene reads a lot differently than it did back then. I'm sure that a lot of people in the theater didn't give it much thought at all. However, today, I believe that even in this film, this unlikely vehicle of Chinese influence, we see a Beijing that is laying the groundwork for its plans in Hong Kong. And the story that I try to tell in the book is much of that story. The ability to look back over the past decade and a half or so and see how China, through its economic leverage over Hollywood, was able to really control the narratives told in the most famous global medium, frankly, of all time. And not only that, but to learn to do it themselves. This is the other element I wanted to address here today, because it's the era we're in now. So I think if we think of the fugitive era of the 90s as the courtship, and we think of the Transformers era of the 2010s as the marriage, I think where we are now in the China-Hollywood relationship is acrimonious divorce, because China has really made it much more difficult to release films, to release foreign films in Chinese theaters, as Xi Jinping has consolidated power and expected his own filmmakers to entertain their people. Now, one of the other things I think that this book affords is the chance to look back and notice how really throughout the entire China-Hollywood relationship, young as it may be, there has always been a student-teacher dynamic at play. In some cases, it was as overt as Chinese state officials coming to Los Angeles for meetings with Hollywood executives, where they would say, how do you market a film? How do you produce a film? And even sit in literal classrooms as producers and studio chiefs would come through and explain how Hollywood had become this essential arm of the American 20th century, right? We all know and are familiar with the concept of soft power. Well, Hollywood did more than just about any other industry or force in cultivating that soft power. And it's clear that China is now trying to replicate those efforts and establish something of a soft power playbook of its own. And over the past 5 years or so, Chinese films being made and released in China have gotten more commercial and have become more popular. So now it's not uncommon for Chinese movies to be more popular at the box office than American films, whereas even starting in the fugitive days, the opposite was often true. And this shouldn't come as much of a surprise, right? We shouldn't be surprised that Chinese audiences will want to see Chinese stories, but it really caught much of Hollywood off guard. And I think that it has really left parts of the studio system here in America left holding the bag and wondering what way they will go forward after a decade and a half of establishing business plans that rely so heavily on a Chinese box office that is becoming more and more uncertain to access. Now, when I was working on this book, I would often hear from studio executives who would say, well, China's plans are never going to work because no American is ever going to see a Chinese film in theaters. And it's true that American audiences have traditionally been very allergic to foreign films. However, I would often remind these studio executives that there is a world outside of America, and that if we look at China's presence and influence in other countries around the world, particularly through its Belt and Road Initiative, we see actually the makings of a potential cultural distribution network. So the final chapter of my book takes place in Kenya, which is a major recipient of Belt and Road Initiative, let's say plans, partnerships, cooperations, loans. I mean, the omnipresence of China there, I think really can't be overstated. I mean, at one point I was in Nairobi reporting, and I was driving down Beijing Road on my way to the Great Wall Apartments. I mean, that is how Chinese parts of Africa have started to feel. And what I was there to explore, and what I think is an underappreciated aspect of this going out strategy from China, is the cultural complement. And in particular, I'd say the film complement to these efforts. So in Africa, some of you may be familiar with a program called the 10,000 Villages Project, which is being operated out of Beijing. It is a state effort to distribute low-cost satellite dishes to 10,000 African villages throughout the continent. And these satellite dishes are not only cheaper than the Kenyan alternative, but they come with channels that show Chinese movies, Chinese TV shows. And I spent many afternoons watching Chinese soap operas with Kenyan families, or Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, over dinner. I, at one point, met a young boy named Lucky, whose hero was the Monkey King. There is absolutely a robust effort here to use culture, use film, use TV shows to introduce these countries and their citizens to China. And in many ways, what they are seeing on screen is reflected off screen in the new train station that's been built, in the roads that are being paved, in the hospital equipment, in the COVID vaccines that are being sent from Beijing to their countries. And I think what the final element of this, before we open it up to questions, that I wanted to convey was that there is not just an economic alliance forming in some of these countries between the Belt and Road countries and Beijing, but in many cases a political alliance as well. My final interview in Kenya in January of 2020 was with a film minister who's in charge of importing and, frankly, controlling the films and TV shows that his fellow Kenyans are allowed to see. And he's an incredibly socially conservative man who feels that it is really his job to be something of a morality police for Kenya. And he said to me very bluntly, he said, I love importing movies from China because they've already been censored for me. And I don't need to worry about Western values that I disagree with coming into my country and contaminating my people. And the day that I was there, I remember it was January of 2020, the day that I was there was the day that President Trump was being impeached for the first time. And he had CNN on the TV in his office. And he looked at me as the, kind of American representative that I was in that moment. And he said, look at what you do to your leaders in your country. I mean, do you really think that's a better system than what China is offering at this moment? And so it really crystallized for me the many layers here that go into this kind of soft power and the kind of cultural sway that a country can foment through its film and TV shows. The films and TV shows that America has sent around the world sold a very particular brand of governance and way of life. And it should come as no surprise that China is doing the same. And therefore, that what is being shown on screen has become this reflection of the larger story of the 21st century, really, which is what brand of governance, what mode of governance will define these next 100 years? And in the case of Hollywood, will the American film industry still be the chief narrator of that form of governance? So those were a few of the points I wanted to hit. I'm sure there may be many questions. I'm happy to field any and all of them. And like I said, again, thank you so much for having me here.
Well, thank you, Eric. That was it was terrific, and certainly the world has certainly changed a great deal in the last 20 years. Can you just a couple of technical things? How do American movies get approved to be shown in China? I mean, I remember there was a quota at some point, 10 or 12 or something like that a year. How does that work? And is it still working like that?
There is a quota. So there are a number of controls placed on the number of movies that are allowed in. And not only that, but when they're allowed in. So Chinese authorities always control so that the American movies can never do too well. So for instance, there's a week where Chinese New Year is celebrated. It's their most popular movie-going week of the year. American movies are never shown during that week so that it gives the full marketplace to Chinese films. But the censorship process works quite simply, which is that once a film is completed, if a studio is trying to get it into China, a copy of it has to be sent to the Ministry of Propaganda and screened for a collection of censors. Now, the censors can be everyone from retired party members to bureaucrats to even film studies professors who watch it for anything that they deem problematic. And there are a few options. One is they can approve the film for release and it goes through with no problem. They can request specific cuts or changes. So they might say, this scene is too gory, or this scene has a reference to, Taiwan that we don't like, or something like that. Or they can reject it outright. And the frustrating element for this process for the studios is that when a film is rejected, there's no memo explaining why. And I think the unpredictability and kind of the unknowability of why a film is rejected is kind of the point, because then every studio lowers the bar and lowers the threshold for what they think might prove to be a problem.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that's how that's how censorship works in China. You don't know where the line is. So. What about sex in terms of censorship?
Sex has to stay pretty PG-13. So no nudity, nothing too risque. I'd say, yeah, but it's interesting is because there's a limit on the number of Hollywood movies released in China, the studios really prioritize certain titles, and the titles that they prioritize tend to be the big blockbusters, the big superhero movies, the big comic book movies. And those are already usually working in a kind of PG-13 space because they want to be able to draw in kids and adults.
You mentioned earlier, Melissa Croteau has asked, can you send your script in early to try to, get it pre-approved, or as in the case you mentioned, the Transformers, they wanted to have a set date. So.
Right. So sometimes you do have to send your script in early if if it's a little bit more China involved. So if you're trying to film there, certainly you have to. I think sometimes if there's particular financing arrangements, you have to get script approval. I think at this point, at the studios, they've absorbed so many of the rules that many executives can read a script and intuit what will be a problem. Now in China, Chinese filmmakers have even more of a process there. They have to not only get the script approved, but then they have to get the final version approved as well. Whereas most Hollywood productions just have to worry about the final product getting approved.
Right. It's somebody, I'm going to see, I have to find this. It's a great question. This is from Greg Chuck. I am interested in disputes that arise in partnerships or cooperative arrangements between Hollywood and Chinese partners. Hollywood is famous for its creative or misleading accounting. Have Chinese partners had problems with Hollywood accounting for their share of the profits?
Oh wow, I think actually, I concede the point about Hollywood's creative accounting. I would say, based on my reporting, I think Chinese firms might have them beat. There is a long string of broken hearts in Hollywood here, um, of executives still waiting for checks to clear from China. During the during the boom times, when a lot of Chinese money was flooding into Hollywood, there were so many deals promised, announced, publicized, where the money never materialized. And part of that was because soon after the money started flowing out, Xi Jinping's government started to take
Yeah.
a closer look to try to control some of that. But I also think that there was a massive cultural difference in deal making. And I think, and I've been told by many executives that oftentimes doing business in China means sort of agreeing to a deal and then negotiating, whereas in
Yeah.
Hollywood people think that it's the reverse. So I have to say, I was just at an event last night where I ran into someone I'd spoken to for this book who was running a company that on a Tuesday morning had to tell all of its employees that they no longer had a business because the Chinese money that had been promised was not coming in.
Yeah. Um, does anybody in Hollywood worry about pushback from Washington or the
Mm.
rest of the country over this, the censorship, if you will?
Yeah, it's becoming more of an issue. I mean, I think, when I was reporting the book, I was struck by how so many of the examples I was writing about of the censorship, I was not uncovering them for the first time. They were reported on
Yeah.
while they were happening, but the response was rather muted. I think because things weren't as tense between the US and China. It didn't feel like these examples were necessarily anti-American. That has really changed over the past couple of years. And the patience I think that politicians and consumers have for these concessions is really waning. And I'll tell you, just in the past 3 months since this book has been out, I knew writing this book, I was not naive that this would be a very popular topic among conservatives. Because not only is it about China, but it's also about Hollywood, right? Like these are prime targets. But I have been struck by the amount of interest from both sides of the aisle. I think this is becoming more and more of a bipartisan issue and more of a bipartisan concern. Now, I have yet though to hear of really what members of Congress or the White House could do in action to change the dynamic here, because you can't really tell Hollywood not to export films to China. All of these studios are part of much larger parent companies that have even more holdings in China than just the studio arms. So I think that there is quite a bit of anxiety in Hollywood about this becoming more and more of a political issue, because really for the first time since its founding, it would put Hollywood at odds with its home government.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I would assume during COVID and also the post-Xi crackdown that the market has become less lucrative than it was before. Is there some waning of Hollywood's willingness to do China favors simply because it's just not that profitable anymore?
It is less of a market, and that makes it less of a financial concern. I still think I'm not convinced that's given the major studios a longer leash when it comes to the kinds of films they'll make. So you're right that the Hollywood studios can't rely on the Chinese box office like they once did. Um, I don't think that means anyone's dusting off their Tiananmen Square scripts, because they still have some access that they don't want to jeopardize. And as I said, if you're working at Universal Pictures, you're not only worried about getting certain movies in, but you're also you also are worried about the theme park that just opened outside Beijing. You may be worrying about the other parts of Comcast and NBC Universal that you're affiliated with. I don't necessarily think that shutting off or restricting access to the box office does much to change the equation here.
So hold on a second. Just a follow-up question. Has anybody used approval for a pre-approval for a script or whatever to raise money? I mean, is that sort of part of in the production realm?
Oh, for sure, for sure. And actually, there was a moment, especially when Hollywood was really waking up to the China market. We saw this boom in projects that were trying to find the perfect story to make a US-China co-production. So almost every producer in town was trying to talk up the Flying Tigers or the Jews of Shanghai, or any story from history where you could plausibly cast Chinese and American actors side by side. There was a moment where that really felt like a gold mine, but very few of them materialized. It's really hard to make those co-productions just because of the approvals and the sensitivities involved. And then we've also seen of the few co-productions that have been made, the most famous and high profile one being The Great Wall, starring Matt Damon, that it's also really hard to make a movie that works in both markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned this thing about Hong Kong earlier, that you could have seen some of the writing on the walls. Is there anything similar with vis-a-vis Taiwan? I mean, I'm sure, as one of our attendees put it, there are the three T's, right? So could you, talk about Taiwan for a second?
To my mind, there's nothing as overt as the Hong Kong example. Part of that is because studios avoid Taiwan, any reference to Taiwan, as much as possible. In fact, one of the most high-profile examples of a Hollywood concession to Beijing came last year when the actor John Cena gave an interview in which he implied that Taiwan was its own country, and days later had to film what really frankly looked like a hostage video apologizing to the Chinese people and saying that he was sorry. And it's not an overstatement to say that video basically guaranteed that his career would continue, because if he had not apologized, he would have been radioactive to the studios and not cast in any of these major films anymore. Wow. So Taiwan, I think, most of it's a great question. And most of the examples we see of the Taiwan issue being reflected on screen have to do with maps. There have been a few examples of maps being shown in films that don't have the dotted line, or that don't have countries characterized the way that China wants their sovereignty to be characterized. But I think at this point, most studio executives know, I don't know if they do a control F for Taiwan in their script, but I think most know to stay far away.
Yeah. I always describe those sorts of apologies as the John Cleese apology in A Fish Called Wanda. And I most unreservedly and completely apologize for anything I ever said or might have thought of saying.
Well done. Yeah.
What about you talked about China's entrance into Africa? What about streaming services? Is there any cooperation between China and the US in streaming services?
No. And this is another fascinating wrinkle, which is that China has three services that really dominate streaming in mainland China. Baidu's service is called iQIYI. Alibaba has a service, and Tencent has a service. And Chinese leaders over the past decade or so have really been quite protective of those services. And so Netflix has not been allowed in mainland China. Disney Plus is not allowed in mainland China. HBO Max is not in mainland China. And it's not necessarily because of they have catalogs or films that are problematic. It's just that they don't want anything to stop the growth of they don't want the competition. So the number of markets that Netflix isn't in is rather small. And the list is telling. I mean, it's like China, North Korea, and Syria. I mean, it's something that drastic. And so when Netflix executives, to hear them tell it, when they realized that they were not going to get into China, they allowed themselves to have something of a longer leash. So Netflix, I wouldn't necessarily say that they are sort of this bastion of critical China expression, but they do have documentaries and movies that explore themes and topics that I think a lot of the other studios wouldn't touch, just because it's just not something that they really can think about.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's something that has happened to China repeatedly. By keeping people out, it also prevents them from having any control over them in the first place. Let's see. Any comments on the impact of COVID-19 and China's dynamic zero policy on the domestic Chinese film industry and its attractiveness to the US?
Well, it's been a big problem because so my book ends in October of 2020, the day that China becomes the #1 box office in the world. And analysts had projected China to become the #1 box office around 2022 or 2023. It became the #1 box office much sooner because COVID had shut down American theaters, and theaters in China reopened much faster after the virus has spread. And so there was this moment in late 2020, you may remember, where not just Hollywood, but so many Western businesses, from cars to fashion to tech, became even more reliant on China because its economy was back to normal at a time when a lot of other major economies were still struggling from COVID-19.
Yeah, Elon Musk.
Exactly. Yeah, Elon Musk, Daimler Chrysler, Louis Vuitton, Apple. A lot of them were saying, thank God for China keeping our lights on here. And that was the case to some degree in Hollywood too. Now we're in a moment where the tables have turned. The American movie-going market is coming back. It's not where it was, and it probably never will be again, but it's coming back in a healthy way. And the lockdowns in China are really depressing the box office there. And the movies that are being released, few and far between they may be, are really struggling to do much business at all. So I guess the big question will be, will this dent moviegoer behavior in China permanently when the lockdowns are lifted? Because right now, I mean, some of the grosses coming out of China are really paltry.
Right. Yeah, and it's like here, it's driving everything into streaming, and so that just you mentioned how popular these the satellite channels, China's satellite channels in Africa are, but how much soft power do you think it really is wielding? How I mean, you've got some anecdotes, but is there any data to show that this is doing something to lift people's image of China? Seems most of the polling lately has been going in the other direction.
You're right, and also, and I don't mean to paint a picture of everyone in Kenya embracing China with open arms, right? I mean, there's the many of the issues, macro and micro, that you all know are certainly playing out there. I don't know off the top of my head what the latest polling shows. I do think that it's worth pointing out that that there hasn't necessarily been a wholesale replacement of American influence with Chinese influence. The young boy I mentioned, whose hero is the Monkey King, he told me that his other hero was Dwayne Johnson. So there is this kind of
very similar.
Yeah, you know, well, yeah, I guess we could tease that out. But there's this kind of coexistence that is happening, and it also in a fascinating way, I think China, at least in Africa, where I know the most, is kind of paying to close the gap and appeal. So, for instance, in Kenya, a lot of a lot of people there speak English, but a lot of it, especially in the more rural communities, they speak local dialects of Swahili. Well, the local dialects of Swahili are not spoken by enough people for Hollywood studios to justify dubbing their films. So they mostly subtitle. Well, Chinese firms actually eat the cost and dub their films. I think the calculation being they know that a dubbed Chinese movie is probably more appealing than a subtitled American one. But if there was equal footing, the American film still might beat out the Chinese film. So it seems like the goal there's sort of divergent goals here, right? Whereas America may have purely economic goals, China has political goals that allow it to subsidize some of those efforts.
But by the same token, since there are political goals, it can also damage the appeal of these, sort of heavy-handed propagandistic. I mean, how good is Chinese? How big is the box office for Chinese films outside of China?
The box office is tiny. The box office is tiny, which is why these the satellite dish distribution is so interesting. But I mean, these Chinese movies that have been coming out, many of you probably have heard of Wolf Warrior 2, if only because it's inspired this whole sort of brand of diplomacy. That made $800 million at the box office, but 99% of it came from China alone. That is still really lopsided, because in Hollywood today, if a movie makes $800 million, chances are 60% of that is coming from outside the US.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it really sounds like these satellite services and all this, the dubbing in Swahili, that these are lost leaders. This is, it's, I mean, aren't the Chinese still sort of myth that, it was the Americans who produced Kung Fu Panda and not them?
I mean, Kung Fu Panda inspired an existential crisis among leaders there, and you're right. I mean, and they asked themselves, why would an American firm take our national mascot and our heritage and make this global hit? And at the time, they even invited executives from DreamWorks Animation over and would interrogate them and say, why did you make that choice? Why did you make that choice? And try to reverse engineer the creative process that had led to Kung Fu Panda. I think more recently, Beijing is looking and with great frustration at the successful soft power efforts of South Korea, with films like Parasite and shows like Squid Game, which are introducing Korean culture in really robust ways. The only key difference and potentially key liability here being that there is no way in hell that Chinese authorities would ever allow the production of a Chinese Squid Game or a Chinese Parasite.
We're running out of time, but if you don't mind, a few more.
Of course.
What about international film festivals? What's the latest on allowing Chinese film makers to go to international film festivals?
The latest I've heard is that it's getting trickier and trickier. There was a moment where Chinese authorities really loved having that sort of credibility on the world stage.
Yeah.
And I've heard anecdotally, now that the festivals are starting back up again, that it's getting tougher and tougher for filmmakers to show their films internationally and to travel to those festivals too. I don't interpret it beyond it being just another reflection of what it feels like is Beijing's skittishness and trepidation on how it's presenting itself to the world.
Yeah. What about Hong Kong? Is China beginning to censor films in Hong Kong?
Yes, absolutely. And there's been sort of the installment of something similar of a propaganda board in Hong Kong. And then Hong Kong, you might know, throughout the past several decades, was this really robust home of
Right,
filmmaking and
right.
sort of globally acclaimed films. What was fascinating to learn in the reporting of this book was just the steady absorption of that talent into mainland China. When Chinese movies started to grow more commercialized and they started to have bigger budgets and be bigger productions, a lot of the directors behind those films had cut their teeth in Hong Kong. Um, and so a lot of the Hong Kong talent that had been working is now making films out of Beijing.
Yeah. I did a story for Time in the 90s about how the Vietnamese film industry couldn't compete with all of the cheap kung fu movies that were
Uh,
coming out of Hong Kong. I mean, they really, you talk about soft power, but they really owned that all of East Asia for a long, long time. But I think you've pointed out a very, very important contradiction in the Chinese approach, which is they want to have this soft power effect, but they're not willing to pay the price in terms of creative freedom. And
yep.
it's there's no way to square that circle. I'm going to close with one very good question here. What do you see 5 years, 10 years down the road in
Well, I
terms of
think
China's influence on Hollywood?
I don't see its influence changing outside of a complete decoupling of the economies. Um, so that would require something quite drastic to happen, I think, right? But I don't see this leverage declining materially in
Mm-hmm.
a way that I think a lot of the topics that we've discussed here, whether it's Tiananmen Square or Xinjiang, or really just any movie that explores contemporary life in China in any complex way, I don't see a world where those stories are told outside of a total decoupling, because the playbook that China has operated under really is to economically punish a company wherever it can,
Mm-hmm.
and so the studios, as long as they are tied to these larger conglomerates, will not really have any freedom to explore those ideas. Now, like I said, the other dynamic here could be that if this becomes more and more of a political issue in Washington, there could be less and less patience for this kind of acquiescence. Um, but I think a lot of the leverage and the dynamic that we've talked about here today, that is really going to be dictated by the larger relationship between the US and China.
Mm-hmm.
And if it devolves to a point where the economies decouple, that's going to change the equation. But until then, I think China's always going to be a shadow influence in these rooms.
But as you pointed out earlier, there is an escape valve as well. There's this parallel system of the streaming services like
Right.
Netflix and I assume Apple, and that, although maybe not Apple.
Now
China.
Apple's got a few concerns in China
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
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 I wouldn't look to them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, this has been terrific, and I've got to say, I've done a lot of these. This is probably the one of the best sets of questions. I'm sorry, I apologize to all of you who I wasn't able to, but I've never seen so many questions, and they're
Oh,
all
that's
spot
great to
on.
hear.
Yeah.
That's great to
So,
hear. Thank you.
and many compliments for your book and for the talk.